to a special edition of the Darden Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. In this episode of the podcast, we're excited to share a recent installment from our ongoing Faculty Spotlight series, a series we call Office Hours, featuring a member of the accountant faculty here at the Darden School of Business, Shane Dikolli. In this episode, we talk with Shane about his background, what he enjoys about accounting, his research interests, his global course in Australia, and more. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. As always, if this conversation is helpful for you, please like this episode and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an update. And remember, you can always check the episode description for links to Darden blogs, social channels, and more resources for tips and insights and stories about the Darden experience. And now, without further ado, here is my conversation with Shane Dikolli.
All right. Well, Shane, can we start with the first sort of softball question for you? Tell us more about who you are.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity, Brad. I really appreciate being here today. I was born and raised in the working class suburbs of Perth, Australia. It's the furthest city on earth from the east coast of the US. And my dad was an Albanian refugee, came to Australia, no money, no relatives in Australia. Here, my mum had an arranged marriage, which was very common at the time for the Albanian culture. And I grew up with three brothers, all very talented at sports. I wasn't very good at sports, so I tried to make my mark in the family academically. So I took a job in public accounting straight after high school and did my accounting degree at Curtin University part-time. I was the first in my family to go to university. And before I finished my degree, I got a job in management accounting at the university, and I did a teaching swap with someone that was in Canada and at Wilfrid Laurier University, and that Canadian professor got me a position there. I taught students. It was the time of Crocodile Dundee, so the accent was really helpful. And I ended up meeting someone who was recruiting the students I was teaching, and we got married 2 years later. I did a PhD. We had a couple of kids. Then I got a job at University of Texas. I was there for 6 years, Duke for 12 years, and then here at Darden for 6 more years. So that's the short summary of who I am and where I've been from.
That's really cool, Shane. I did not know that you worked part-time while doing your undergrad.
Yeah.
It feels like you could probably relate to some of our working professional students who are doing school and work at the same time.
Exactly. I know how hard it is. And actually, I'm teaching part-time students for the first time this year coming up. And I can certainly, it resonates with me what they go through for sure.
So you started doing accounting pretty early on in your life. What attracted you to accounting?
I'd loved numbers as a kid, and I would say the beauty of bookkeeping. In grade 10 at high school, we got an opportunity to take a bookkeeping class, which was the first time it was offered. It was unusual, and I just loved the idea of working with numbers. And I just found a passion for something where everything balanced, everything had a double entry, and the numbers told a story about a business. So I just loved that. And from there, I took accounting every year during my getting of a degree and at high school. It was, and then during my PhD, of course. So it was something that best decision I ever made was to take that bookkeeping course.
Wow, the small decisions that we make when we're young people, it's amazing how they can put us on a path. I'm curious about what led you to teaching. Obviously, it sounds like you had this teaching swap, you found yourself in Canada, and the rest is history, but why teaching?
Well, when I was a management accountant at Curtin University, I went to the cafeteria one day, ran into one of my professors that used to teach me management accounting, and he said, "We are desperate for part-time instructors. And so would you be willing to just teach a class for us? You wouldn't have to change anything with your job. You can just do it out of hours." So I taught part-time, and I loved it. I had grown up when my brothers were out playing sport. I would be at home pretending to be a teacher, and that helped me academically. And so it just felt very natural, and I thoroughly enjoyed it and have not stopped since. So that was more than 30 years ago now. Yeah.
It's interesting to hear you talk about when you were a younger person, sort of pretending to teach. We had Yael on Office Hours a couple of years ago, and she said that she's been teaching since she was basically a kid. She was like a tutor essentially for a lot of her friends, and it starts
awesome.
early, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how did you get to Darden? You mentioned a couple, places that you'd been before, Texas and Duke, but what led you to Darden specifically?
I'd been at Duke for 12 years and loved it there too. It's a outstanding university and Fuqua School of Business. I have nothing but good things to say there. But Luann Lynch had heard that I had a popular class at Duke in management accounting, and she came over and watched me teach one day, and she decided that it would be a good idea if I came to Darden to see what it was like here. She thought it would be a good fit. And I resisted for a couple of years, and finally, once my kids went off to college, I decided I'd go take a look. And I sat in on Elena Lutskina's class on private equity and venture capital. And within minutes of being in that class, I knew this is where I'm supposed to be. It was it just again felt very natural. It felt like the right place to be, and the case method really spoke to me. And so after that, I made some moves to try to follow through with Luann's invitation to apply for a position here, and I haven't looked back. It's been a wonderful 6 years that I've been at Darden.
I want to ask about that class with Elena that you sat in on.
Yeah.
What was it about that class experience that felt so natural or that was so engaging?
Yeah, so Elena did not lecture. So she had a blackboard. She had no notes in front of her. She wasn't looking at any notes. She just knew her stuff. And she asked the students a lot of really probing questions, and they loved it. They were into it. They responded without any hesitation. She had no trouble cold calling people, and the students weren't intimidated by that. They found it very, as part of the class, that they felt like they needed to participate in ways that would engage their classmates. And so just that experience of seeing classmates help each other, the instructor truly facilitating rather than telling students the answers to questions. And it just felt like that's the way I want to be in a classroom, and really be a facilitator rather than be telling people things.
Well, that brings us to a question about your experience here at Darden. Obviously, you've been at Darden for several years now. You taught full-time MBA students, executive MBA students. You'll be teaching part-time students in the coming academic year. What have you enjoyed about being at Darden?
Oh, certainly the case method teaching. We have a conversation rather than me lecturing. And in the core of our full-time program, we also have a very team-based approach in preparing how to teach a case. So we will meet before every class and talk about different ways that we could ask good questions to get the conversation going, and let the students learn the important concepts and help each other out. I find that the students at Darden self-select into an experience where they know they're going to need to engage to succeed. So they do so not only in the classroom, but outside the classroom as well. And so it's not just a teaching experience inside the classroom. It feels like a learning experience outside the classroom too. So the faculty who self-select into this environment know what's coming, and they're also given explicit incentives to do well, not just at research, but also to generate transformational learning experiences. So it's a school that's unusual in that it offers these explicit incentives for the faculty to try to create these transformational experiences. I think the staff even self-select into the environment. They know what they're getting into. They know the mission of the organization. They want to help the organization fulfill its mission of creating responsible leaders through transformational learning experiences, and it all comes together beautifully. And then I have to say, the school allows me to take students to Australia, which I just love to do, and showcase my homeland to Americans who, many of whom have not been to Australia before. So it's just a joy to be able to do that. So, I mean, I could keep going on, but you get the sense of how much I enjoy being on faculty here.
I want to ask a question related to something you just shared. So, as a faculty member, how do you think about developing a curriculum or developing a course that's going to be transformational for students? What does that mean?
Yeah, I think it means that the student cannot just be passive. So you can't give the opportunity for students to be passive and just write down notes and then try to figure it out later. The students have to be engaged in some way. So I really strive to try to make it as experiential as possible. And so I will ask the students their backgrounds and learn a lot about their backgrounds. I try to learn their names before I first meet them. And what I'm trying to do is to let them know that I see them and that I want them to be included in the class, and I want them to share what they know so others can learn from that. And so having the right questions in place as a foundation, and then knowing the students and knowing that they've self-selected into this environment where they want to be engaged, just helps me try to create an experience where they can feel it, that they can feel that they've learned something different, and it's wisdom that they wouldn't get just from reading a book. And so I really strive to try to make it as engaging and as experiential as possible.
Well, we talk about the case method often on these office hour sessions, and I want to start with maybe a basic question, because I know we have some prospective students on here who may not be that familiar with the case method. So how do you explain the case method to someone who doesn't know very much about it?
I think 4 words, and it comes from my former colleague who was a legendary dean. He was a distinguished professor. He was an unmatched case writer. He wrote a book, and it's called Ask Often, Tell Seldom. And that really summarizes what I view as the essence of the case method, which is that we go into class with some really thoughtful questions that we can ask the students, and some pastures of questions that we want to ask students. And then it's up to the students to respond based on the preparations that they've done with their learning teams outside of the classroom. And they come to the classroom prepared to address these probing questions. And then out of it, the discussions invariably head down the path of some key concepts about accounting that they can use going forward. And so that type of learning tends to be more embedded and ingrained in what they understand going forward, rather than a short-term, yes, I can remember that and I can regurgitate that in an exam. It's not like that at all. It's much more about what do you embed going forward, and as part of the wisdom that you collect throughout the classes. I really think that for someone to know something or some topic really well, there's 3 elements. One is knowledge, one is skill, and one is wisdom. And I think that good undergraduate programs do a terrific job at imparting knowledge and helping students develop skills. But what we try to focus on here, I think, through these experiential experiences and getting the students engaged, is that we want them to collect wisdom by learning from each other, by learning to address tough questions, and also by learning how to ask good questions. That's really what's driving this collection of wisdom that they hopefully get as they work through their MBA here in the case method approach at Darden.
I know this is probably an unfair and maybe impossible question, but is there a case that you really enjoy teaching?
There's so many to pick from, but the one that sort of stands out is a case that was written almost 20 years ago now. It's called Berkshire Toy, and it's not one that I wrote, although I've written a variation of this case, which I'll use going forward. But Berkshire Toy was based on the Vermont Teddy Bear Company, and it's a variance analysis case, and it is very dry, all the calculations in the variance analysis. And one day when I was driving into work and I knew I was going to be teaching the case that day, I thought, oh no, I can't go through how dry the numbers are in this case. So I just decided, as I was driving into work, that I was going to make it a role play. And so the beautiful thing about the case is there's 3 divisions, and I assign the students into one of 3 divisions: marketing, procurement, and also the production division. And I send them off to their separate their case meetings or departmental meetings. And then they each come back after having looked at the numbers. And then I ask them questions about why did the company goes so poorly in the current year? It's a pretty simple question. They come with their ideas, and it's amazing how once they're put into particular perspectives of a specific division, they take on the roles of those divisions to heart. And so there's a lot of conflict that happens in that case discussion, but we're all in character, and we stay in character the entire time. And at the end, I end up firing someone from the organisation, and so it's just a way where the students really feel it. They feel engaged in it, and then they learn a lot about how to interpret the numbers. It's the same numbers, but they're interpreted very differently depending on the perspective that the students come from.
People always ask us, that's a very common question for us to be asked as admissions representatives, how does accounting work through the case method? Because people think about their undergraduate accounting class or just the fact that numbers are involved, and they're interested in the case method, but it sounds like a stretch to do it. Do accounting in this way. How do you teach an accounting class through the case method?
Yeah, I would have, if I knew nothing about the case method, I would have been skeptical at first, but I'm certainly not now. What we do is we try to develop the intuition for how to construct the numbers, and we're less concerned about students doing reps of calculating numbers, because the reality is most of the students that come to Darden won't be the preparer of the numbers or construct the numbers, but they will use the numbers to make important business decisions. So a lot of the class discussion is on how to interpret the numbers, how to identify additional information to make the numbers even more decision useful, and also how the numbers that we extract from the case can drive business success through careful decision making. So it's really more about developing intuition and being able to have conversations about accounting, which is the language of business.
You teach accounting in the core curriculum at Darden for folks who are just learning about the academic experience. In all of our MBA programs, there's a core curriculum. The core curriculum is actually the same across all of our MBA programs, followed by an elective period. How do you see accounting fitting into the core? What do you enjoy about teaching accounting in the core?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go back to this point that it is the language of business, and I get to have conversations in this language with smart and curious and engaged MBA students, and those conversations, I think, I'm confident, make a difference in their lives ahead. So in that sense, I'm helping them to understand the language of accounting or the language of business. And so I'm hopefully being a beneficial presence for them, which is a mission of mine in life. I just love to teach cases where I can also have conversations before class with my colleagues about what is a good question to ask here to try to prompt the learning that we're trying to impart. And so I just love those meetings. Like I said, in the core, we have them every year, before every case, but we do this every year. It's not like I've done it once and I've not gone back to those meetings. And the meetings are not the same. Even though we might use repeat cases, we're always thinking about ways to ask an even better question than what we currently have, and take the conversation from down different paths, and also try to inspire the students to think more about how they can introduce contemporary examples to use accounting in a way that's decision useful. So it never gets dry, never gets old. The case method is just a way to keep it really live and interesting. It's never the same each year. You can imagine that if you were lecturing, the lecture could seem like the same each year, and quite frankly, you could just go watch a video if it's just a lecture. But those conversations are never the same, even between classes in the same semester. So, I just love that.
Also, something of a prospective student question that we'll get on occasion. Accounting is one of those classes that can feel intimidating to students who do not have a background in accounting. Many of our students at Darden have not taken accounting before, have not taken finance before, come from maybe more liberal arts backgrounds. What would you share with those students who might have that concern?
Yeah, a few things. One is we don't exempt any CPAs from class, and that might seem like it would make it even more intimidating because we've got CPAs sitting in class. But I would say many of the CPAs, if not most of them, would say that the way that we teach accounting here is different to how they learned it in their undergraduate or their Masters of Accounting program. But it's new to them. The take that they see in a case method class is new to them, and they're a reliable source of foundational information that can help their classmates, not only in learning teams outside of class, but also during class. Instead of me answering a question that might be raised, I might redirect the discussion to someone who might know the answer, that's a CPA, for example. So I think that's one thing that we do to make it less intimidating, is to have the people in the class that it's not just one voice that's telling them an answer. There's all sorts of voices that can help with that conversation. We also have pre-Darden, we have the opportunity for our students to take a Coursera course that my colleague Luann Lynch teaches, and I think that's excellent preparation. I'd highly recommend it for someone who's not had any accounting experience. And then, of course, we have Darden before Darden, where there's accounting taught there by Luann as well. And so there's lots of opportunities to prep before we get here. There's opportunities during the experience to leverage classmates who are taking the course. They're not allowed to exempt out of it. And I think that persistence matters a lot in learning the accounting, and having conversation matters a lot. It's not just a matter of sitting down and doing textbook problems. It's having conversations with classmates that enables people to learn what we want people to know from accounting by the end of the course.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We've really, for our professional degree students as well, worked over the past couple of years to expand out the resources that are available to them. They have access to the accounting MOOCs that you mentioned. There's another product called Be Ready that Mark Lipson, a member of the finance faculty, developed. We also have Darden before Darden, where they get to meet some of the faculty members who they will have over the course of their program. And so parallel structures across the full-time, part-time, and executive MBA in terms of some of this academic onboarding. And I think it helps for people who maybe feel a gap there and they want to diminish the learning curve they'll experience in the program. Just even knowing the vocabulary can help, or some of the concepts. So I want to talk about some of your classes here, Shane.
Sure.
And so you taught, you've been teaching an elective called Strategic Costing. I think it was actually in J-term, which is a short 10-day term offered in January between the fall and spring semester. I think you had enrollment across all of our programs in that class. So what is strategic costing for people who are curious about this class?
I think the essential idea is that it might seem easy on the surface to be able to figure out the cost of an iPad or the cost of some sort of service, but dozens of decisions go into determining how that cost is determined or figured out for a specific business decision. And it can vary depending on the decision that's being made. And so we look at different types of decisions, how we might use costing differently. And one of the main assignments for class, and I think this is one of the really attractive features of the course, is that the students need to describe a case vignette where they've encountered the obstacle or challenge of having to figure out what the cost of the product, the service, the customer, the region, the department, what that might be before they can make a business decision. And so these vignettes are discussed in class, and also as we progress during the course, those vignettes are evolving as well as we learn more content about the strategic costing course. So the fact that the students can bring something directly from their experience into class and work on it, a challenge that they've faced outside of class, and bring it into class, is something that I think they really value. And in the J-term, we had, like you said, from all formats, and we had it here in Charlottesville. So the executive students got to travel down for an extra experience in Charlottesville, and the next year we're actually going back to DC. So we're sort of rotating it around, and it's open for me. It's open to anybody. I'm happy for any Darden student to take the course, and it's offered in the spring usually. So, and that's the main elective that I teach. I also teach in the core, and then I take students to Australia on global immersion course.
All right, we're going to talk about your Australia course momentarily, but I want to stick with strategic costing because
Sure.
It's really interesting to think about how a company arrives at the cost of a product and how they think about that. There's their internal considerations, but you also have the external consideration of the market and competitors. And
Yep.
Is there a particular product that you enjoy talking about, or a case that you read in this class that's emblematic of that discussion?
Yeah. So we do a lot on manufacturing initially, because I think that a lot of the concepts are easy to visualize. So, for example, you can see a product at the end of it, and you go through the value chain to figure out, well, how does it attract cost at this stage of the value chain? Should we be thinking about making it more accurate, this way of costing, so that it reflects the consumption of economic resources? And so there's all sorts of decisions that can be made along the value chain to get to a final product. But then it becomes pretty clear that you can transfer whatever you cost into other really important environments. So I really like actually doing cases that focus on the customer, and trying to understand the cost of a customer, because I think that this is something that we don't pay a lot of attention to, say, in an undergraduate degree or even in the core course. And so I'm trying to understand better how companies think about what their customers cost them and whether it's worth acquiring a different set of customers through Facebook ads or Instagram ads, and the costs associated with that. How do companies account for all that in trying to determine what customer base that they want? And should they be firing customers, for example, if the customers create too many demands that are costly, that typically don't get costed in a regular costing system? So there's all sorts of issues that could come up there. And the other thing I would say is healthcare. I think it's really important to understand costing in healthcare. And one of the dangers, I think, is that as more and more healthcare environments are acquired by owners that want to keep costs low, one of the troubling things for me, and we talk about this in class, is how do you balance health outcomes with trying to keep costs low and make a profit out of some sort of a healthcare environment? We look at some research on that too in the class. So there's lots to cover in the class, and I'm really proud of the material that we go through. I think it's important work.
We have a question here in the Q&A about outside speakers in your classes. I know this happens in a number of Dart classes. Have you ever had an outside speaker? Do you ever think about bringing someone in to talk with the students?
So I don't, in the courses that I teach at Darden, just because I know that I've got more than enough content, and I want the students to be the ones that are driving the learning of that content, rather than a speaker telling their views of the world. And I do think that, and not that speakers aren't valuable, because we do have a lot of speakers at Darden. A lot of them are outside of class too. So I think students can get an opportunity to see speakers outside of class. And then, of course, on the Australia trip, which we'll talk about in a moment, we have it's all guest speakers. And so having conversations with them, it's a lot less about lecturing and PowerPoint slides, and much more about, tell us about what you do, what your challenges are, and how you try to address those challenges. So if I do have a guest speaker, it's much more about having a conversation rather than having them lecture.
All right. Well, that brings us to your Australia course. Now, you lead a Darden Worldwide course, which is a global elective that's offered to full-time MBA students, and you've also taken executive MBA students to Australia on a global residency.
Yeah.
So both populations of students have had a chance to go to Australia with you. What do you enjoy about leading these global courses to Australia?
I love the fact that the students go there thinking that, oh, this looks pretty similar when they first get there, to how they see things in the US. But it's pretty clear by the end of the week that there are some differences that they haven't seen in the US before, and I think it inspires them to think differently about how they might perform in their roles going forward, or maybe they should think about doing a transfer or rotation in another country just to get a sense of what it's like to understand doing business in other countries. So the whole aim is to understand how local cultural influences in Australia shape the way in which business is done in Australia, from Australia, and with Australians. And so they learn a lot from that. And I think one of the best quotes I've seen in the final deliverable in the that the students submit is someone said that when you first get there, there's a lot of things that look familiar, but once you see past the familiarity, there are things that we can learn and apply back to our jobs as global leaders back in the US. So that is really meaningful to me, that the students have picked up on those nuances, and it's because they are, I'm not telling them here are differences between the US and Australia, they're experiencing them firsthand. So I feel tremendous pride, I feel great joy, and just unequivocal gratitude for the opportunity to be able to showcase my homeland to people that have from Darden, smart MBA students from Darden. And so far I've taken 128 students across 5 trips, and we've got another group next month, so we'll be up to 155 over 6 trips by the end of June. Yeah.
That's awesome. For folks who are just wondering, a Darden Worldwide course is a global elective that full-time MBA students can participate in. It's not required, but many full-time MBA students will participate in at least one Darden Worldwide course, occasionally 2, you'll hear. For our executive MBA students, interestingly enough, they are required to participate in 1 week-long global residency. There's potentially 8 to 10 different global residency locations offered. We also have another format within the executive MBA program called the GEMBA format, where students are required to participate in 4 week-long global residencies. That's effectively the max global option here at Darden. And for our part-time MBA students, somewhat similar to our full-time MBA students in that they have the option of participating in a global elective that's offered to the part-time MBA students, typically in the fall of their second year. The locations that have been offered to part-time students thus far: Italy for the first class and Argentina here for the second class. We're waiting on additional details for the third class students as to where they might be able to go in the world. So a little bit about the global course landscape here at Darden. So Shane, on these global courses in Australia, typically visit 2 cities. In the past, it's been Sydney and Melbourne. I think Perth is going to be added to the mix here. Tell us a little bit more about what the course looks like.
Yeah, so typically 2 cities, 5 or 6 visits, corporate visits in each city, and then usually 2 or 3 cultural experiences in each city. So the one to Perth next month, we're going to Perth for the first time. So I think it's the first time there's ever been any sort of course where a University of Virginia student has been to Perth, Australia, the furthest place on earth. And so there we've got the Clontarf Foundation, which is a not-for-profit organisation that helps Indigenous young boys get through school and help them with their lives ahead. We're also meeting with South 32, which is a spin-off of one of the biggest mining companies in Australia. We're also meeting the City of Perth, the head of economic development there. And we're also meeting with individuals who have worked in the US but now work remotely from Perth, Australia. So we're going to get a sense of what that's like to actually be an American or have worked in America and then now work in Australia, and they'll be able to have some insight about work-life differences between the 2 countries, which I think is really good. In Sydney, we're going to visit with Qantas, with the Australian Ballet at the Sydney Opera House. We're also going to meet with the CFO of the largest telecommunications company in Australia, Telstra. And it's a program where the students will learn a lot just from having very informal conversations. It's not death by PowerPoint. It's very much some introductory questions, asking the speaker to tell us about themselves and what they do on a daily basis and what challenges they face and how they address them. And then the students are amazing at asking questions. Like every single trip that I've done, I've never, ever been crickets in the audience from the students. They have questions to ask. They want to learn. It's wonderful.
One of the cultural things that you sometimes hear about Australia versus, say, the United States is um, the tempo of life, or how central work is to people. U.S. obviously being something of a work-obsessed culture. Australia perhaps a little different than
Yeah,
that.
I think so. One of our speakers that we'll meet in Perth, who's worked in both places, he describes it as working to live in Australia rather than living to work. And I think the students see that by the end of the week as well. There's a very strong culture to protecting people's time outside of work hours. People in Australia will often say things like, "I think I might take July off," and they can. Like, there's people to cover them. Whereas I don't hear that very often, where people just take a whole month off and go travel Europe or go travel Asia. And so I just think that one of those, well, when the students observe that in Australia, they think, how might that be able to be translated back to their home country, or what could they do to try to inspire creative ways that work-life balance could be a little better preserved in a way that Australia gets it right. I'm not saying Australia gets everything right. They don't. I'm biased. I know I'm biased. But at the same time, there are some things I think that we can learn from the differences. And that work-life balance, I think, is one.
Yeah, I love your point about Australia perhaps seeming more familiar to students, and maybe people being kind of assuming that this is going to be very similar to the United States, and then
Yep.
discovering over the course of the week that perhaps things are not quite so similar.
I mean, even coffee shops. There's a lot of coffee shops in Australia, and the quality of the coffee, though, is unbelievable. Like, they talk about a coffee culture in Australia, and it's true. It's high quality barista made coffee, and when people are at work during the day, it's quite common to actually go out and have a business meeting at a coffee shop, and you'll sit down and enjoy the coffee. And I always say, you sip the coffee, you don't drink it there, because it's so good. And so that's another way in which they just enjoy life outside of work, and even within work hours. I'm a big fan of the coffee in Australia, as you can probably tell.
I think it was just a few years when the flat white took over the
Yeah,
world. That was
long
very
blacks.
popular.
Yes, in Australia we call the Americanos long blacks, and I'm big into those. Yeah, yeah. You go to the coffee shop or the pub, actually, with your mates, and that's another thing I really love about Australian culture, is that people follow through on their mateships. So you look out for others, you never let your mates down, and I just think that's a really um, very appealing feature of the Australian culture, and students see that as well. They're surprised by how intrigued that Australians are with the American accent, and so they'll go into a coffee shop or a pub and start talking, and then the Australians want to talk to them. So it's lovely.
How do you feel like these global experiences, these global courses, add to the overall MBA experience?
Yeah, I lost track of the number of times students say to me, "Is there a way that I could work in Australia, even if it was just for a short period of time?" And I mean, I don't have a channel of opportunities for them, but I just encourage them, if they're interested, look for ways on LinkedIn or whatever it might be to do it, because I think it's worth doing. And I do know some people who have gone down there and have loved working in Australia. I'm confident that of the 155 students by the end of June that will have been to Australia on these trips, there'll be moments in their future business lives where they'll remember something that happened in Australia, a moment that happened in Australia that might just influence the decision that they're about to make at work. And it might inspire a different way of thinking about the problem. And it could also change where they locate the problem. They could reach out to people that they've met during their visits in Australia to ask their advice on things. And essentially, those moments and how they might affect future business decisions of leaders throughout America is really, I think, the sorts of, that's just gravy. If that happens, I would just be very, very happy. I just want to see those experiences translate into decisions for students going forward. And in that sense, I think that they could be viewed as transformational experiences. The immersions are things that you just don't get in a classroom sitting in Charlottesville, and you couldn't do as a tourist either. So I'm really proud of what we do in Australia.
All right. Well, I want to talk a little bit about your research interests. We got about another 15 minutes or so here before we wrap up the conversation.
Where's the time gone?
Yeah, exactly. You talked about Australia. Things really move quickly. One of your research interests is around a CEO evaluation and compensation. What got you interested in this topic?
Yeah, it's a PhD. I knew I wanted to do management accounting because that's what I had a background in. And when I got to the University of Waterloo, I did my PhD. At the time, the topic of how CEOs were paid and why they were paid what they were paid and what performance measures went into their contracts was something that the media cared about, regulators cared about, academics cared about. And so I gravitated towards a topic that looked at what emphasis that CEO compensation designers put on forward-looking performance measures in their compensation contracts, and the basic model that I developed showed that the CEO's decision horizon would determine that. The shorter their decision horizon, the more emphasis there would be on forward-looking performance measures. And from there, I've worked on a series of other projects that relate to this idea of how should the contract for a CEO be designed, and how does accounting measures feed into those contracts? And that's branched into what benchmarks do we use to evaluate performance? So relative performance evaluation. We've also looked at papers that examine what emphasis do designers put on performance measures when they decide to dismiss the CEO. And what we find there is that inexperienced CEOs, they rely much more on measures because they don't have a lot of other information. But for experienced CEOs, their ability's been revealed over time, so they don't rely on performance measures as much. And we find that empirically. And then one of the most interesting papers I think that I've worked on in the past 5 years has been on CEO integrity. So in that paper, we look at CEO shareholder letters. We count the number of excuses using a dictionary of words that are related to excuses. And the CEOs that have abnormal levels of excuses also have low levels of employee satisfaction, or lower levels of employee satisfaction, and also higher audit fees. So the auditors have to do more work. And so we interpret that as evidence that CEOs that have to make a lot of excuses tend to be ones that have lower integrity. And so we control for things like, well, what's the environment like, macro environment like, what's the competitor landscape look like? So it's a paper that I've really enjoyed working on. And then more recently, I've worked on ESG mutual funds with my colleagues here at Darden. And then another colleague used to be an MBA student at Darden, who's now a faculty member at Fordham University, Michael Gual. And so we've got a series of papers that look at ESG mutual funds and whether or not they say that they do what they say, or do they walk the talk. So are they investing in ESG mutual funds? Do they vote in favor of environmental and social programs in the companies that they invest in? And then more recently, we've looked at why mutual funds repurpose from being non-ESG to ESG, and whether they attract more capital flows. And essentially we find that they don't. They tend to just shift the alignment of their investor base. So that's a big summary of a whole range of topics there.
Well, I
Brett?
want to come back to CEO compensation because it
Yeah, sure.
remains in the news. I think there was a recent article about CEO compensation has never been higher than it is right now, and you compare that to what your average employee is earning, the gap between the CEO pay and your average employee, it widens and increasingly widens with
Yeah,
passing years. So it has to be interesting to look at CEO compensation in this particular context, particularly given some of the considerations around integrity and the things that you mentioned.
absolutely. And it- part of the reason why it's easy to motivate these sorts of studies is that the regulators are so interested in them as well. The amount of uh, compensation disclosures that are required now has just expanded enormously since 2006, and there was another set of regulations in 2010, and even more recently, there's regulations that require firms to disclose their key performance measures, which is a great thing for accounting researchers. And so I'm very interested in the topic. It's easy to get people to buy into why this is important. And I often get asked the question: do CEOs pay too much? So do I believe in the line of inquiry, I guess, that the media has on this? And my sense is that there are absolutely some examples where it's hard to justify why a CEO gets paid as much as they do, especially relative to competitors. But on average, I think that there is a market for CEOs where the supply of high quality CEOs is relatively low. So markets would suggest that you have to pay more for a good quality CEO, and so I think we're seeing a lot of that, and it's hard to um, I kind of promote that view of the world, given the noise with the few extreme examples that that the media likes to, I think, focus on.
Yeah, I was thinking about it as you were talking about CEO compensation and how much of it is it internally directed and how much of it is externally set, right? The market for a CEO. You sometimes feel like if you are a particular CEO in a particular industry, working for a particular kind of company, how much flexibility does the company have when they think about compensation, do you think?
Yeah, and I mean that's a really good question, and I think that that's going to be investigated more going forward, purely because the regulators require a lot of disclosure, a lot of transparency about the CEO compensation and the performance measures being used and so on. And so there's a line of research that's starting to look at, well, if they're forcing us to disclose what goes in the CEO's contract, aren't we giving away trade secrets about what makes us strong? And so there's some, I guess, camouflaging of what the true performance measures are, and it's not clear how the disclosures will be enforced if they do deviate away from what the true performance measures are. And I think there's going to be a lot more emphasis on subjective evaluation, where performance measures will be implicitly used, not formally used in the contract, because if it's formally used, it has to be disclosed. But if it's implicitly used, I would imagine that there's a little more discretion for firms to design the contracts the way that they want to, rather than being forced by, say, external competitors and what they say that is important for performance.
I want to come back to your topic of ESG mutual funds
Sure.
as well. ESG has been a very hot topic in U.S. investing. It's been under attack by some folks for political reasons. It's also we had a conversation with Pedro Matos as part of the Office Hours series where he talked about it being largely kind of still undefined exactly what it is, not as heavily regulated as you say see in Europe, and so maybe a little bit more of a free for all here in U.S.
Yeah.
markets.
Yeah.
What got you interested in ESG, and how has your research continued to evolve?
Yeah. The original reason why I joined my colleagues Luann Lynch and Mary Margaret Frank, who's now a dean at Keenan Flagler, as well as Michael Gall, was the idea of integrity. So I just finished working on the paper looking at CEO integrity, and they were interested in this idea of ESG mutual funds. And the common link between the two was this idea that do the mutual funds walk the talk? Do they say something and do something else? Do their actions honor their words? And so it seemed like a natural extension to this theme of integrity. I'm very interested in the topic, and so that's the reason why I got interested initially. And then the second paper that we did actually brought this idea back to the executive compensation level. So that particular paper looks at whether or not ESG mutual funds vote in favor of compensation, executive compensation proposals that incorporate environmental and social objectives. And what I like about that paper is that we show that they do, but it's more about just providing more transparency. So those who put forward these proposals that they want compensation changed are suggesting that there should be a change in compensation and these measures should be included. But the ESG mutual funds will only vote in favour or tend to vote in favour of them more only if it just provides more transparency, so an additional report, rather than they don't want the compensation actually changed because that's costly and it's forcing the compensation designers to do things that might not be optimal for the firm. So I just find it a really fascinating area, and that we can weave executive compensation into this idea of how ESG mutual funds behave.
Yeah, it's interesting. We actually have a question in the Q&A along these lines of looking at executive compensation in light of incorporating, say, ESG metrics or pushing environmental social governance change. Is that something that you explored?
Yeah, that I haven't personally, but there is some work on this, and does it make a difference? And I think the takeaway at the moment is that it certainly makes a difference to how much the CEO gets compensated, but the jury's still out on whether or not it's effective for the firm. It's hard to see the counterfactual of what would have happened if they hadn't incorporated these ESG metrics. But some might argue that it's not relevant to the bottom line profits. What it's relevant to is does it satisfy different stakeholders, and does it ensure that the firm is sustainable going forward and not hurting the environment and acting in a socially responsible way going forward. And so those questions are still being investigated and open-ended, but they're not ones specifically that I've taken on at this point.
All right, we've got a few more minutes. We got a few more questions for you. Thanks to all of our attendees for your questions so far. Shane, you were chosen to give the last lecture to the full-time MBA class of 2023. This is a tradition, happens at Darden every year in our programs. And what is the last lecture for folks who don't know much about this?
It originated from a professor by the name of Randy Porsche, who was at Carnegie Mellon. He was diagnosed with the terminal disease. And he was given an opportunity to give a last lecture, knowing that it would be the last time that he would ever have the opportunity to disseminate ideas. And so in essence, the idea is that if this was the last lecture that you would ever do, what would you want to say? And so I've thought a lot about these types of things because I've learned a lot over the years, and it's so hard to be able to boil things down to just a few key messages. But that's the challenge and the beauty of doing these sorts of last lectures, is it makes you reflect and it makes you come up with ideas of what it is that you want to impart to others if you had to give some simple messages. And so I worked hard on that and really enjoyed it. And what I did was I had some messages that I wanted to convey, but I told stories that led to those messages, stories throughout my professional career, and including how I got to Darden. And so in the end, it wasn't difficult to write. It was very enjoyable to put together. And I just have a lot of gratitude for the opportunity to be able to do that.
Any lessons from that last lecture that you'd like to highlight for our attendees here?
Sure. The four lessons I had was curiosity ignites learning. Doesn't matter where you are, so it's always important to ask good questions, and any context, any meeting. The second thing was integrity builds credibility. It comes out of my research mainly, but I've learned over time that if you do what you say you're going to do, people trust you and they tend to give you jobs and have faith in your abilities that you might not realize that you have. Third thing is happiness drives productivity, and it's not the other way around. I think people have this idea that if I'm really productive, I'll be happy, and it's not. You have to be in a happy place first to be productive. Fourth thing is that less on the other side of complexity can be more. So you can put in little effort into a task and it's not going to go too well. It's not going to be very effective. But if you also put in a lot of thought, so I'm thinking about, for example, preparing for class. You can put hardly any effort and just come to class and you might not get a lot out of it. But if you put in effort, you debate the issues with your classmates and learning team, then at the other side of that learning team method, you have some ideas of what to talk about in class. Then you go to class, you ask good questions. On the other side of class, I think there are some key messages that can be really impactful. So less on the other side of complexity can be more. So they're the four things that I tend to, well, at the moment is my four key messages that I would do at a last lecture.
Well, Shane, we are wrapping up here, but I want to ask one more question from the Q&A and then ask if you have any book recommendations for folks who've gotten interested in the conversation. So this question from the Q&A caught my attention just because it's obviously we're talking about AI, generative AI, all of this is in the news all the time. Do you have any thoughts of what artificial intelligence might mean for the accounting industry or folks who work in those kinds of roles?
So I talked about bookkeeping earlier and the beauty of bookkeeping. AI is going to replace humans doing that, I would think. And so I think that's going to have a big role on generating numbers. I also think that there's going to be a lot more conversations that MBAs will have with potentially a robot, and the robot will be able to generate numbers quite easily. And so some may say that the pure accountant's role is going to be diminished in many ways. I tend to be a little more optimistic about it than that, and that is that I think that the pure accountant's role will be expanded to develop decision alternatives. And so they won't be just crunching numbers. They'll be more like MBAs where they'll come up with suggestions that they will propose for their for their supervisors, and so I think there's going to be a big role for especially management accountants going forward.
That's an interesting question about sort of what can a robot or the machine do versus what the humans can really add to that, right?
Yeah.
I guess decision making to present alternatives to sort of vet those, think about how they might play socially, these kinds of things, and impact on stakeholders. That feels like a uniquely human pursuit. So, last question for you here. For folks who've gotten interested in the conversation that we've had today, any books you would recommend? We typically ask for 3 books.
Yeah, so this sounds self-serving, but I actually loved this book before I came to Darden, and it's the president of the University of Virginia's, just very simple, based on a graduation speech, a commencement speech, I think. It's called Wait, What? And he identifies, it's very simple, easy read. It's this simplicity on the other side of complexity of key questions that you can ask that will generate other good probing questions. So if you want ideas for how to ask good questions, I highly recommend Jim Ryan's Wait, What book. Angela Duckworth's book on grit. It's a wonderful summary of how important grit is and that it may matter more than talent in successfully navigating abstract goals in life, particularly career-related goals. And so she talks about it in terms of passion and perseverance. And then Sean Aker has a book on the happiness advantage. And in that book, he talks about this idea that happiness drives productivity, not the other way around. And he has research that he cites. And for anyone that's ever worked on a task that they've really loved doing, and then all of a sudden they look up and 3 or 4 hours have gone, that's what I mean, is that once you're in your happy place, you can be super productive in terms of getting things done because you've found a happy place first.
All right, Shane, last question for you. Any advice for our attendees today? Some of them may be starting at Darden this August, some of them contemplating a future MBA journey. Any advice that you would share with them?
I'm going to quote a countryman of mine from Australia. He's an author, And he also had a graduation speech. He said the following: life is best filled by learning as much as you can about as much as you can, taking pride in whatever you're doing, having compassion, sharing ideas, serving others, and being enthusiastic. And I think that if any student came to Darden with that attitude, they are going to thrive at Darden, and it'll be the best 2 years of their life. So, that's the advice that I would have.
Shane, thank you for joining us. It's been a great conversation. And as always, we'll share out this conversation on our podcast, Experience Darden, and the ExecMBA podcast, as well as the Discover Darden blog.
Thank you so much, Brett. I really enjoyed it.
That was a recent installment from our ongoing Faculty Spotlight series, a series we call Office Hours, featuring Darden faculty member Shane Dikolli. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at Darden, that's DARDEN, @virginia.edu. Until next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.